My history with Houston Audubon started at the Piney Woods Wildlife Society right after I moved to Houston. I moved to Kingwood, and my first place to go bird watching was the Katy Prairie, back before there was a Katy Prairie Conservancy. And while I was out there looking for longspurs, I ran into another guy birding alone, looking for the same thing I was looking for, and it was Jim Stewart. And Jim Stewart got me to the Piney Woods Wildlife Society. And subsequently, Gary Woods, who was president of Piney Woods at the time, so coming out of the Piney Woods experience, when Gary Clark became president of Houston Audubon, he realized that no one was taking care of the Dammoth sanctuaries. He asked Piney Woods if they would like to be the stewards for then Dammoth Sanctuary, and then almost immediately we received 2 more properties from Stephen Craig Dammoth, and which was called the Dobie Tract and Winters Bayou. And we formed a committee up there. Jim Stewart led it. I was his co-chair, and we began to take care of and manage that property. And that's how I met Malcolm Dammoth. And meeting Malcolm Dammoth up there was really a seminal little exposure that I had early on that really played into High Island. Malcolm Dammoth owned a 630-acre tract that had been logged over back in the early 1900s. Came into his family, and from that moment on, he shepherded the forest to regrow and became his personal sanctuary. He donated that to Houston Audubon, and then his son decided the 2 tracts he had, he would also donate to Houston Audubon. And that was a couple of other tracts that were both more than 100 acres each, as I remember. I've always worked for Phillips Petroleum Company, and Gary Clark felt it was great to have somebody with an oil business background to be on the board of directors. And with my familiarity then through Piney Woods of the Dammoth Sanctuary, I was invited to fill a vacancy, a half-term vacancy in, I believe it was 1988, when Gary Clark was president and right after he'd left Piney Woods. And that was how I ended up on the Houston Audubon Society board. And how I began to become more and more involved with the Dammoth family and with our needs at High Island. So at the time Amoco was selling their properties down there, we had received from Lamar University in Beaumont their lease with Amoco for a 10-acre tract of good birding woods. At the time, we'd also as I came on the board, we also had, as I recall, about a $37,000 debt for the purchase of a share of Smith Oaks, and we'd also had some debt remaining yet on what we called Boy Scout Woods, later known as Lewis Smith Woods. That was at that time frame, that debt. And at the time, Houston Audubon didn't have deep pockets. $40,000 in debt was a lot of debt. At the same time, I had a vice president in ConocoPhillips who was interested in doing conservation projects and had already gotten ConocoPhillips involved in the Playa Lakes joint venture. And one of the people working for him knew of me and knew of him and put us together. And we became quite a team in Phillips Petroleum at the time. And then the last thing that happened, which was hugely important, was the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a number of other agencies began what was known as the Partners in Flight program. At the time, there was recognition that North America's migratory songbirds were in steep decline, and there was concern about why this is happening. What can we do to study it? What can we do to stop this decline? And a lot of federal funds became involved at the time, and there was a great deal of energy to work with non-governmental organizations at the same time in tackling this enormous issue. Houston Audubon is in the oil and gas capital, arguably maybe of the world, and not everyone in the oil business is as people may assume. And certainly there are people that care about the planet and care about where they work. And there were people in Amoco that felt that way, as well as John Whitmire, who became my backbone, or became my foundation, or my quiet support. John was so committed that ultimately we got him promoted to be on the national board for National Audubon Society. And he was instrumental in supporting myself and garnering an amazing amount of support from Phillips Petroleum, whether it was the land department to help us deal with land issues, or whether it was our drafting department to help us draw up numerous maps of various properties. And those maps, you can still see derivatives of those maps being used today. The overprint of the oil industry at High Island is due to the fact that High Island is a salt dome. That salt dome produces a positive feature on the landscape that in the times of hurricanes, it truly becomes an island, and many people have survived hurricanes by evacuating to High Island and then going back down the peninsula to see what's left. And that's been true as long as there's been people on Bolivar Peninsula. It turns out that salt domes are very good traps for oil and gas reserves. And early on, there were discoveries in certain spots around the dome, but ultimately Amoco recognized how big the potential was, and they began buying up all the smaller firms and ended up accumulating quite a land holding around there. And if you go to Smith Oaks now, you can still see their old pump house building. There used to be several large oil tanks there, and this used to be the gathering spot for production. And also Amoco had a fresh sulfur mining business there at the same time. And the Clay Bottom Pond, where our rookery is right now, was actually one of the ponds where they gathered fresh water that they used for this sulfur mining process. Utilizing the resources that I was able to tap through the support of John Whitmire in Phillips, I made approaches to Amoco and found my way into the Amoco Land Department, where I was able to make a pitch for Houston Audubon saying, we really need to expand our properties. High Island is becoming more and more popular. More and more birders are coming. We have a very small footprint. We have a very tentative hold on a portion of a really wonderful woods, which is almost completely surrounded by Amoco property. We really would like you to become a partner with Houston Audubon. We would really like to figure out some way of acquiring these migratory woodlands for the purposes of the general public. We'd also like to be able to improve our trails such that people now have to wear boots and the trails are becoming deep with mud. We really need to do something because we have people coming from all over the United States to see birds on Amoco properties. So one thing leads to another. Amoco said, that's an interesting idea, let us think about it. But so at the time I was talking with John Whitmire, I said, John, we really need toilets at High Island. And I was having my interview with John. I was explaining all the stuff that was going on and my initial thoughts and how I'd had one conversation already with Amoco. And I said, can I get some money out of ConocoPhillips to help out on this? And he said, well, Steve, I said, look, this is John Whitmire was telling me, he says, I'd really like you to put something a little better. I'm not sure all I want to do is have Phillips' name on a bunch of toilets. And John Whitmire didn't laugh or chuckle much. He was a pretty serious guy most of the time, but he laughed about that at that moment. And so he said, on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, come back to me with the whole plan. And I did. I came back with him, and I cheated, though. I had two pages. But I gave him the first one first, and it was just everything we wanted to accomplish. But then the second page was the business plan. And that's when things got serious. And National Fish and Wildlife Foundation had set up a fund for Partners in Flight, wherein challenge grants were facilitated for projects that passed approval by the various agencies involved in the Partner in Flight program. John Whitmire saw this as a perfect analog to the joint venture programs, and he'd been having enormous success with the business unit that was operating in the Panhandle of Texas. So it was very easy for us to step into that type of a structure, at least with respect to John Whitmire. And so he said, put together more. I need to see a proposal that you want to send to the Partners in Flight program. And I want to see what I can do with the Public Policy Board at Phillips Petroleum Company and see if we can come in with some better support. And at that same time frame, there was a Partners in Flight meeting in Galveston in 1991, early 1991, I think maybe February. I met there Peter Stangl. I met there a long list of names of people that were working Partners in Flight. David Pashley comes to mind, John Bergen of the Nature Conservancy and others. I met at this meeting and said, look, here is our problem. Here is our opportunity. What can we do? Peter Stangl was directing the Partners in Flight program at NIFWF, and his eyes showed that he was seriously interested in what I was saying. And from there, the whole thing began, and by 1992, we began forming Fund A, Fund B. We ended up with Fund E in the end, each one representing a different iteration of matching various funds together through the Challenge Match program, which was enormously successful in enabling us to build the partnership that we did in order to get done what we got done. So the next step was grant writing. And I never wrote a grant before, but I had some help. But I ended up putting together a stack of paper that was about a ½ an inch thick with everything that we could throw in there. It was too much. But I still had the two 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper that John Whitmire wanted me to write up at the very beginning. And of course, we had a little history and a little bit of discussion. That document ended up being photocopied an amazing amount of times. And one copy went to Amoco at one point in time. But that copy also formed the basis for John Whitmire to support a presentation to the Phillips Petroleum Board of Directors after it had passed approval by their public policy. And the proposal was $60,000 for Phillips Petroleum, later to become ConocoPhillips. Phillips Petroleum decided that was the right number. And why that number? Well, it turned out that to buy the remaining shares of the Smith Oaks property, they wanted $120,000. So this became a perfect number to match. $60,000 here, $60,000 from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through the Partners in Flight program. We got $120,000, we can buy the property. Turns out this time the Dameths wanted to have one of those properties back for family reasons. They offered us $100,000 for other land purchase elsewhere if they would be able to receive that property back. And that was one of my first acts then as a board member at Houston Audubon, was come and say, hey, look, I've been offered $100,000 for one of our sanctuaries. And it put me in an interesting position on the board, and maybe with the membership, one of the first acts that can be seen at Houston Audubon. All this other stuff is behind the scenes, but the first act would be, well, we don't have that property anymore, but we got $100,000 in the bank. So this was an interesting starting point for me with respect to my commitment at Houston Audubon. So I felt compelled to make sure that we didn't end up spending $100,000 on electricity and water, and it made it back into the land. And the Dameths certainly wanted that as their donation now of $100,000 rather than a piece of property. That concept drove an awful lot of Fund A, B, C, D, and E in the end. Because everyone we got money from, they said, oh, you can't match government funds with government funds in a challenge grant. In other words, say you can't use funds from our philanthropy for bricks and mortar. They have to go to programs and infrastructure and maintenance, or programs, education, these sorts of things. And others would say, okay, we can do improvements, habitat improvements, habitat protection on the land with the funds. So putting these funds all together became an enormous issue. And we, in the first year, we ended up with, that we began to accumulate, this was 1992 by then, we ended up with Fund A and Fund B, and then ultimately we had to have a Fund C as we got another $60,000 in the second year from Phillips Petroleum. They said, well, we got to keep going with this. The program is developing. You're pulling pieces together. However, there was a large holdup at one point in time, and that was due in part to a family that we had living on the property, the George family, and they'd lived there for free through the good graces of the original owners of the property. But they felt some sense of ownership, and that was something that was handled delicately. Gary Woods led our president at the time, succeeding from Gary Clark. Got involved deeply in those kind of negotiations, and ultimately we achieved success. The Georges created quite a bit of interesting times down there as they were battling one way or another to not allow the property to get away from them, even though they had really no ownership there. Eventually, they sent us an all is well letter one Christmas from Oklahoma. They'd moved, and they said, well, we're very happy now, and we think this is the best answer, and hopefully everything is water under the bridge. And we decided to accept that in good graces, and everybody turned out happy. That was challenging because it held up the receipt of that property. And at the same time, Amoco, as part of their donation, had a $200,000 grant for coastal conservation with the Nature Conservancy. What they decided they wanted to do is they wanted to take $120,000 of that $200,000 and purchase the Smith Oaks property. Well, that was an interesting thing to manage as well, because the Dameths wanted to buy that property with their $100,000, and ConocoPhillips had $60,000 in there to match NIFWF, and they felt like they were buying the property. Well, ultimately, we got everyone happy and redefined the funds, and were able to start spending money. And we had the Georges off the property. We had, at the end, we had one interesting negotiation with Amoco as to the liability clauses by taking ownership of those properties. And in the end, John Whitmire again traveled to Chicago, laid out the case that if something happened to be found and a contract came through on the acquisition of the lands that said all future liabilities are Houston Audubon's, the argument was made by Mr. Whitmire that you probably don't want Amoco, through this type of clause, to be the company that destroys Houston Audubon through unmanageable liabilities of historical use of the land. Eventually, the legal people were convinced by the senior management of Amoco that we should all be partners and let this happen, if it ever happens, as it would, and remove those clauses. Then the dam burst, and in 1992, there was a meeting of the partners in flight again in Galveston. The heads of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy, Amoco had people there, Phillips Petroleum, publicity people, packaged up some amazing handouts. We had press. We were on the news. Wake up, what was it, Good Morning America, I believe, on one of the NBC or CBS. And we ended up celebrating the coming together of the Nature Conservancy of Louisiana, who were supporting the Nature Conservancy of Texas, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Amoco, Phillips Petroleum Company, and of course Houston Audubon. We received approximately 175 acres from Amoco. We ended up generating enough matching funds that Fund D ended up largely supporting Bolivar Flats, another wonderful story, which I'm sure will be spoken about here as well. And through that funding process, we're able to build a tower and help with bollard expenses and build some signage at Bolivar Flats as a result of this program. In the end, it was about $2.2 million was assembled, and the people, I have to name some of the people at Houston Audubon that really got the job done. And whatever money was raised, Winnie Burkett was able to spend that money and keep it within the bounds of the funding requirements. Bill McClendon, Herb Orwig did amazing jobs in making sure all the bills, everything passed audit for all the funds. And also Steve Carroll was behind the scenes in all of our legal documents and in our real estate and land issues, many of which were dealt with through some assistance from Fulbright and Jaworski as well. So Fund E became the birth of the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory in the end. This had always been a vision of the original plan to have a bird observatory at High Island. Well, for one reason or another, it didn't end up at High Island, but it did end up in birthing Gulf Coast Bird Observatory. And that's a pretty proud accomplishment of Houston Audubon, along with many other accomplishments. And of that last Fund E, a portion of it went $25,000 to building their Cecilia Riley Center at Gulf Coast Bird Observatory as the very end of the last money that came out of the High Island Initiative. I'm sure I'm leaving something out of the stories. We even had leadership within the heirs of the Hughes estate, which were the owners of Smith Oaks. At one point in time, our residents there, who had no real tenure on the land other than their presence, had decided that they were going to set up their own reserve system, began issuing patches and, well, actually stickers, and charging entry fees. And eventually we invited them to share some income and through the sale of our patches, which started in '89. But at one point in time, there was a little bit of disagreement how this should all play out. And the entrance road was blocked with large pieces of trees, and fishing line was laced back and forth across all the trails. And one of the heirs, who was willing to sell her piece of her property for the $120,000 we were offering, basically took a chainsaw out, started a chainsaw, and here's a woman walking down the street, and she's going through the tree limbs, and she's slicing through the fishing line, and everybody stayed out of her way. But eventually the sheriff came and got involved, and they were preparing a court order that the public streets needed to be maintained open, and eventually it faded away. But there were some testy moments. I was really fortunate to be on the board of directors during this time frame, from 1989 through 1996, when I left Houston on transfer. During that time period, we would have board meetings that would start at 7. Later we moved it to 6 because it was lasting so long. We would stay in board meeting until 10:30 in the evening. And this was during a work day. We had them on Tuesdays. The first Tuesday, I believe it was the first Tuesday of every month back then. And it was quite a ways to. It was an interesting way to start your week by not getting home. I lived in Kingwood at the time, so I had to drive an hour back after the meetings. This era, '89 to '96, saw Houston Audubon raising money to defend Wallace, the Trinity, Lower Trinity River from the Wallace Dam project. At the same time, Houston was exploring the idea of building a West Side airport between Brookshire and Katy on the prairie, something that would basically bury an awful lot of wetlands, prior converted wetlands. There was a number of environmental issues out there that said this wasn't a terribly good idea. The Federal Aviation group from Texas, their pilots association, sent us a check for $1,000 to help legal fees. They didn't want to fly airplanes through geese, which is no longer there because the rice is no longer there. But back then, we would have 250,000 to 1 million geese out there every winter. These things that happened during this time frame are part of Houston Audubon's legacy. We birthed Armand Bayou, for instance. Armand Yamatagui, whose name I'm sure I just butchered there, was a member of our board of directors at one point in time. The Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, the Katy Prairie Conservancy, the wildlife refuges that now exist in the Trinity Valley with the boardwalk that overlooks the Spoonbill Rookery there just as you cross the bridge at Trinity. Houston Audubon has been enormously impactful in very positive ways in the Houston area. And this period of time, all of those things were passing through the board during those 4 to 5 hour board meetings that we had. So Houston Audubon is recognized as one of the leading chapters in the United States as far as what we've been able to accomplish. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, it helps that we're in a really huge city. But it also helps that there's an awful lot to be done around here. So it's not like we're just trying to go watch some birds. There's stuff that needs to be done, and somebody needs to do it. Why is Houston Audubon successful? Well, it's the quality and depth of the board of directors and the staff and the community that supports it. And it's a three-legged stool. And, if you didn't have the opportunity, of course, we wouldn't be here. But that doesn't mean that we would be able to do anything about it as Houston Audubon. So a Houston Audubon board member gets there because they already have something that's burning in the back of their mind, or they have a need for an outlet. Houston Audubon provides that, as long as you're within the mission, obviously. But the thing is that everybody on the board is carrying weight. This is a working board. It always has been a working board, and the board is never 100% in favor of anything. That's why we have 4-hour meetings. But the fact is that it's going forward all the time. So I would say, yeah, it's leadership, and that leadership is experienced through each leg of the stool. Community giving is as important as board leadership, as important as the dedication of the staff. And Houston Audubon is a national leader because of that. There's one other thing about Houston Audubon that for me surpasses everything else. And that is, it's an avenue for personal realization, for self-realization. And it can start just with helping on a stewardship committee for one of the properties. And Houston Audubon is incredibly enabling. If you have an idea, you have a passion, and it fits in the Houston Audubon mission, then anything's achievable, virtually anything. And it's just individuals who have, and it's not one individual, it's not a single individual, it's a team. There's no question. There's many people whose names I haven't mentioned in my remarks today, but in every one of these, whether it's Armand Bayou or the Katy Prairie Conservancy or the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, the sanctuary system the Houston Audubon has, the succession of people and passion and self-realization has been enabled through Houston Audubon, and it'll continue to happen. And it's not fly-by-night. It's permanent. It'll live longer than we will. So it's some place to go.